The front door was locked. An old protector formed of ancient wood bound by rusted iron had been forgotten by time, yet it still sat resolutely within the entryway to bar entry to unwelcome visitors. "Is anyone home?" Autumn hoarsely called as she hammered her tired fists upon the weathered wood. Into the chamber beyond her knocking resounded, and only the creaking of wood was her answer. Nothing living stirred or called back in reply. The door rattled in place as she shoved upon it, hardly budging from its frame. Autumn had to resolve herself to the fact that nobody was home and, judging from the overgrown state of the grounds, they hadn't been in a long time. She needed to get inside as her blood loss was getting dire. Her mind was growing increasingly hazy as the adrenaline that had been coursing through her wore off. Casting her gaze, she noticed a cloudy window beside the door. Retrieving a discarded rock, she smashed in the dusty pane. The crashing noise resounded around the clearing. As carefully as she could in her cold and naked state, she picked out the remaining glass from the window frame before hauling herself in. A cloud of dust greeted her as she tumbled, causing her to cough and sneeze into the silence. Once her fit had passed, Autumn cast a tired and fugitive glance about the dark chamber lit only by the pale moonlight streaming in through clouded windows. An ominous atmosphere, to be sure. Hanging from the ceiling all about the room was a myriad collection of dried herbs, vegetables, and near-petrified remains of unidentified animals. At the far end of the room was an unlit fireplace stained by soot and ash. A chimney ran up the back like a crone's spine from the cozy hearth, twisting until it breached the ceiling. Within it a warped black iron cauldron hung, awaiting use. The firewood that had been once fresh beside it now had colonies upon colonies of mushrooms growing upon it. Near the fireplace and taking up a majority of the right-hand side of the shadowed chamber was a tattered bed that was practically blanketed with dust. The musty sleeping space was only shielded by a hanging molded curtain that was so moth-eaten that it could be mistaken for lace. An old broken wardrobe filled with rags that might once have been clothing sat at the foot. Opposite, on the left-hand side, was a workspace laden with shelves of dusty jars filled with various unidentifiable substances, some even softly glowing to Autumn's concern. A fetus of some strange creature still pulsed and moved with one jar beside another, just packed with eyes of every coloration. Across every unoccupied surface was a scattering of unlit candles that had melted down onto whatever surface they graced. A humanoid skull ran with waxy tears. Autumn wondered what they had done to receive such a fate as a candleholder in death as she shakily entered the space. By now exhaustion utterly racked her body, but she had to tend to her injuries first before the bed could claim her, lest she not wake in the morrow. Woozily, she made her way across to the old wardrobe, leaving behind bloody footprints. Reaching inside, she grabbed a few old dresses and shirts and began cleaning herself. The gross soul water that still clung to her and her still flowing blood stained the rags immediately. She tore the cleanest of the rags into strips with her teeth and uninjured hand till she had enough to bind herself. Autumn was in a sorry state. Bruises and cuts covered her skin from her flight, and every point where a ghost had touched her was irritable and red. The handprints stood out on her pale flesh. The first of her injuries she sought to mend was her hand, as it was in the worst state and without its use, the rest would be much harder to tend. Autumn eyed her hand, the stumps of her fingers torn ragged with the white of bone peeking through. Even if she had the fingers, she doubted that could have saved them. As best she could, she cleaned them of the dirt, and grim tears sprung into her eyes as the throbbing pain became much more. Once done, she turned her attention to the fireplace. The wood placed beside it was nearly unusable, but there were a few pieces that were just dry enough to light. With one hand, she awkwardly built a fire by stuffing a few shreds of dry cloth under the kindling inside the hearth before fumbling with a flint till sparks caught. She gently blew upon them, hoping they would bring warmth and light into her nightmare. Thankfully, they did, and soon a fire began to grow and shed a billowing heat upon her tender frozen flesh. Autumn basked in the heat a moment before plucking an old iron poker from beside her and thrusting it into the fire, tending it till the metal glowed red. Like an angry devil, it blazed as she withdrew it from the fireplace until she held it before her bleeding stumps. As she clenched her teeth upon a bite of wood, she pressed the heated metal upon her ravaged flesh. She screamed into her teeth as a white-hot pain engulfed her. Autumn found herself unnerved and disgusted at how hungry the smell of cooking flesh made her as the remains of her fingers seared close. Sweat poured down Autumn's forehead and plastered her tangled black hair onto her face. She took the cleanest of the rags and wrapped the hurting and burnt wounds. She knew she needed to keep them clean, as she'd die if they got infected. Moving on, Autumn turned her attention to her feet. They were ruined. It surprised Autumn that she could even walk, given the state of them. The skin had been worn off by who knows how many hours of dancing, and the flight that had followed had embedded thorns and stones within. Pure adrenaline had fueled her into ignoring the pain, and only now was she feeling it, and it was hell. Holding in her whimpers, she pulled free the invading fragments from her soles. The pain was almost blinding as she cleaned the bloody mess and wrapped them in strips of makeshift bandages. Soon she had them as clean and covered as she could. All that remained to deal with was her ravenous hunger. The dried vegetables hung mockingly high above her. As getting up again would hurt far too much now that she had become aware of her wounds, she instead crawled over to a moldy broom propped up against the wall and used it instead to smack a few stringy vegetables free. Autumn feasted upon what she assumed were carrots. At the very least, they looked like them. The taste was as bland as could be because of their dried nature, but she was starving, so she choked them down. As the last of her secured food vanished, a rumbling noise outside drew her attention, so she made her way to the shattered window she had entered from. Outside across the wild lawn, the Phi hunters had arrived. Not all mind, just a few dozen of the thousands that made up the wild hunt. Not that it was much of a consolation. Each Phi being was of a different shape or size than the rest, warped by whatever values of beauty they abided by. The riders had stopped at the edge of the clearing and were warily eyeing the charms of bone that waved in the wind. And it seemed as if the charms were gazing back. Rusted iron nails held each of the charms that Autumn could see in place. Autumn recalled that cold iron was said to ward off Phi folk. She only hoped that their rusted nature wouldn't affect them too much. As the hunters spotted Autumn peeking out at them, they snarled and cursed at her, furious that she had found shelter. Nervously, Autumn glanced at the heavy door that had barred her entrance. Now behind it, she could see that a heavy iron bar was latched in place and had rusted shut. Looking upwards, she also saw an old iron horseshoe that hung protectively over the doorway. Perhaps to ward off evil? Or at the very least, the Phi. Autumn snuck one last tired glance over at the Phi before retreating to the bed. There was nothing she could do right now about the hunters gathered, and this hut appeared to be shielded from their intrusion. What better place was there to rest her weary bones? Tomorrow, she promised herself, she'd deal with it. Autumn dusted off the bedcovers as best she could before crawling her abused and battered body onto the creaky frame. The flare of pain from her aggravated injuries caused her to wince. Like the saddest of burritos, she wrapped herself up in the tattered blankets and quickly drifted off to the land of sleep, hoping that this was all a nightmare and that she'd awake tomorrow in her bed. Yet it was not to be. High above in the shadowed night, a duo of shades rested, the third having been rent asunder by a sight best left unseen. A deal concluded. A young wench hast been delivered. The first shade giggled. A dram late, one might argue. The second shade replied. 'Tis not mine own fault that the wretched hag did fail to account that another world might find it the gall to name their children after the seasons. Nor is this year's autumn dead yet. That child's day of birth still looms after all. The first shade mocked. Whilst comical 'twas it behoveful to setteth the wild hunt upon the wench? The second shade questioned. 'Twas worth it to behold the look upon the fair maiden's visage. The first shade spoke. Besides they art destined foes, I just gaveth a dram nudge. When Autumn next awoke, it was to the intense aching in every part of her body. She had pushed every muscle in her body to its limit and then urged them beyond. Somehow, even her eyelids ached. Still, it was that hurt that made her realize she was still alive and that the events before her slumber hadn't been a wicked and terrible dream. Autumn's body shivered in its sweat-soaked state as a building fever racked her body. Despite the alluring urge to surrender to the lull of sleep and ignore the twitching of her muscles, she couldn't, as not only was she hungry once more, but she hadn't forgotten the fire outside. With an extreme force of will, she pulled herself upright upon the soaked sheets, groaning in agony as she did so. As slowly as her body allowed, Autumn stretched out her muscles, working to relax those that had tensed up in a cramp. As they loosened, she became more of a person and less of a barely functional zombie. Nearby, the small fire she had lit before still crackled slowly away, almost finished consuming the wood she had left it. The radiating heat it provided offset the chilling breeze that floated through the space from the broken window she had made. Aside from the hearth, the only light inside the hut was that soft moonlight let in by the cloudy windows. After wiping away the grime and dust as much as she was able with loose bedding, Autumn gazed outward and up. Despite resting what was most likely a full night's rest, the hateful moon still hung in the sky above, unmoved from its cage. It would seem that the sun did not grace this realm at all. A loud gurgle interrupted Autumn's contemplation. She clutched at her stomach as it announced itself. She held no power to make the sunrise, but she felt she could at least feed herself. Autumn's gaze swept the room for any scrap of food. Last night, she had devoured the carrot-like vegetables to the last stringy strand, so she needed to search for another source of nourishment. The shelves of assorted jars would be a last resort, so she hobbled over to the fire. There beside it, in a small alcove, was a shabby pantry. It was in as much of a sorry state as herself. Time had rendered anything fresh that may have once been housed within into dust. All that remained was a meager scattering of dried and desiccated food. Still, she wolfed those down as her only other option was the garden outside, and who knew what lived within. A wineskin she had plucked from the shelf had a mouthful of what may have been wine at some point. Now it tasted like vinegar and sorrow, but she was hardly in a place to complain. With that, her voracity was quelled. It was time to address her most immediate issue, that of apparel. Or a lack of it. Currently, she had nothing to cover her modesty aside from a wet blanket and shame. While it was possible to fashion one of those two into something wearable, she had spotted proper clothing while rummaging for rags. The old wardrobe was still ajar, with ripped clothing spilling forth. Among those tattered pieces were a few that, while time and the elements had worn them down, were still somewhat serviceable, at least until she found proper civilization. One that was hopefully friendlier than the Phi. The underwear available left much to be desired, as they looked much more like baggy shorts tied up with cord and a loose, white-ish shirt, but it was better than going commando. The undershirt's material scratched roughly on her battered and sensitive skin. After struggling into those, she plucked up a fraying gray tunic from the pile. It was laced up at the hips on either side and sported a deep V-neck that could also be laced closed. With minimal cursing, she struggled into a pair of thick brown pants made of musty-smelling hide or tanned leather. While rough on the outside, they had been lined with a softer material. The clothing was fitted for someone not much shorter than Autumn was, so while the pants rode a little high at the ankles and the top was a little scant at the wrists, it wasn't too bad. While age had eaten away at them, they still beat running about naked to the wind and elements. Autumn stuck a finger through a moth-eaten hole in the sleeves. Next marketplace I find, I'll replace it, once I get money, of course. Resting at the base of the wardrobe alongside a musty pair of frayed socks was the saddest and most beaten pair of leather boots she had ever seen. Autumn wasn't much of a shoe kinda girl, preferring either running shoes or work boots, but even she would have to admit these were ugly as all sins. The leather was stained and far more cracked apart than an old man's face, but they were all she could find in her size. Anyway, it was far too soon to wear anything on her wounded feet. Turning her attention back to the wardrobe, she spotted two more articles of clothing that would complete her ensemble. That of a hat and a robe. What had once been a dark black robe had faded away with age into a hazy gray. Yet, despite its advanced years, it still kept a level of comfort Autumn desperately desired. Her slender arms disappeared into voluminous sleeves as the heavy fabric fell upon her narrow shoulders. She felt secure in its billowing grace and bundled warmth as it draped down past her hips and thighs to swirl around her calves. A small iron chain that was untouched by rust fastened either side together, and Autumn wasted no time in securing it together. Upon further investigation, she found to her surprise and delight that the inside was lined with many deep pockets, including a few secretive ones in the lining she barely caught in her inspection, perfect for hiding coins, trinkets, or other valuables inside. She had never been in love with any article of clothing more. Once finally snuggled deep within the warmth, she set to examining the last item, the hat. A peak had wizened and folded down upon itself like the hunched form of a man's spine beset by age. Upon its black leather shone a crone's face of gray cracks and wrinkles that spidered and crept down to a rat-chewed brim. It was an old witch's hat. Yet despite that, it was proud, regal almost as it hung in place, and as Autumn placed it upon her much younger brow, it dipped under a weight that took her by surprise. In fright, she tore it free and held it at arm's length. With no small amount of trepidation, she placed the hat back upon its rest. Okay, weird. What else is in this place? And Autumn, be more careful with spooky things. Now that she was clothing-clad, Autumn set about examining the shelter she had invited herself into. She had caught a brief glimpse the night before in her hurried rummaging, but now she had further time to plunder this stranger's hut and find the secrets hidden within. The place that had first captured her wayward attention even with the flaring pain in her feet was the shelves that lay burdened with a myriad of jars and bottles that contained all manner of wondrously creepy contents. Among the rows, Autumn spied bottles of dead pixies with wings of glitter, jars that held bats' ears or frogs' tongues, a glass jar that held within pure darkness, and many, many more strangeness. With the wall as support, she hobbled her way across to the display, cursing under her breath as she went. Below the shelves sat an old workbench that numerous substances had stained. The wood had warped to a palette of splotched colors. An equally weathered and worn chair sat before it as if awaiting an occupant. Autumn obliged the seat and gave her aching feet a rest. What she hadn't noticed earlier in her search for aid for her wounds and nourishment for her growling belly was an old dusty book resting on the stained tabletop. A cover of aged leather was bound along the edges and spine with thin patterned iron that had worn smooth from oils and time's touch. Enclosed within were many yellowed pages that had warped and buckled. It looked more akin to a tome of old than any simple book. Autumn picked it up with care. in her hands. It felt heavy, and she wondered just how long it had been waiting for a wandering soul to page through it. With as much care as she could muster, she cracked it open, the iron and leather creaking as the cover shifted and its dust fell away. The first page was nearly blank aside from a series of strange runes and markings that, despite never seeing before, Autumn could understand. Before her eyes, they resolved and thus they read. Beware all who read the private property of witch August. Be ye witch hunter, may you die in a fire. Be ye adventurer, may you eat troll dung. Be ye tax collector, see all the above. If you are still reading this, that means that you are not any of those listed above, or all the deadly curses I had placed upon this tome have faded. Call yourself lucky if so. Autumn glanced nervously down at the book in her hands that hadn't burst into a cacophony of spells and violent exhalations. Seeing that she indeed could call herself lucky, she flipped the page excitedly in search of more hints of magic within. This tome of witchcraft and arts most black is the property of witch August, the most terrible and wise. Within you will find my last will and legacy to be passed on to a young witch destined to surpass me. In my entire lifetime, as long and storied as it was, I failed to find such a girl who could inherit my vast knowledge of magics. I had tried it all, every advice my so-called peers had graced upon me. Kidnapping a lowly peasant, creating one from blood and magic, even bewitching those in need of power, yet all fell short. In my desperation, I even contacted those blasted fae that ruled the lands I found had hidden my abode, but the slippery gobshites found some way to weave around the wording. My every utterance of ordeal would leave them in fits of giggles, only uttering that she would come despite Autumn already passing sevenfold. So despite all this, I am left with my only option, to write everything I know or have accumulated in my lifetime within this leather and iron tome and hope some girl of destiny wanders in to find it. A slim hope. Or perhaps you are the girl promised? Either way, it matters not only that my knowledge and legacy carry on. Oh, and my hat, I suppose you can have that too, if it has survived. Gentle was the rage that boiled beneath Autumn's skin, anger bound by society like a dog chained that eyes the hand that strikes it with a simmering intent. She needed a moment to think, to breathe. This was the reason she was here, why she had to endure all the pain, misery, and fear. She suffered because this witch had made a poor deal with the fae. Within her aching breast was the seething desire to cast the ancient tome into the crackling fire, to cast the instigator of her toil into the depths, to be forgotten by all and deny the wicked witch her last will. Yet even as the hate festered within herself, she could still see that this was her chance. The fae still awaited her outside, and they'd eventually find a way inside or just starve her out. So she clung tightly to the book and its offered knowledge. Magic was the unfulfilled dream of countless of Earth's generations. Its boundless grasp had tantalized many and she couldn't pass up the chance to learn. It would become her strength. With a quill in her uninjured and non-dominant hand, she viciously scratched out Witch August's neat handwriting and filled in her scrawl. Beware all who read the private property of Witch August Autumn. After taking a calming breath, Autumn filled her mouth with dried fruits that tasted of bitter lemons and sweet chocolate, before turning the page. Many are the ways to pluck at the weave of magic, to make the world bend to one's will. Sorcerers would pull from their blood, casting the magics of the ancestors. Fae, fiend, angel, or even draconic. Wizards study the ebbs and flows. They forge magic through the discovery of the many pathways that permeate the many worlds. In contrast, we have warlocks, pacted casters who are bound to their patron and can only cast what is allowed to them, often at the cost of their very soul or something equally dear. Druids give and take with nature and rune lords carve with bone, stone, and metal. These are but a few examples. Witches take a different tack in controlling their weave. We are beings of purest emotion. Never let it be said otherwise. We pay for every spell and ritual with emotion. It is the most potent source of power aside from the soul itself. But that is a lesson for another time. Any emotion can work. Anger, hope, desperation, fear. Some work better than others for specific things. Anger for attacking or love for protecting. For example, collecting a single emotional type works best. It creates pathways or grooves that make subsequent efforts all that much easier than scattering yourself too far, as it will make you unfocused. But how do I collect emotion? You may ask, and where do I keep it? Well, in a hat, of course. No, really. With a witch's hat nestled upon your head, you simply reach inside and feel that emotion. Once grasped, pluck it free and tuck it under your brow warmer. However, a word of warning before trying. If you haven't skipped ahead, don't take it all. Why? You ask. Well, if someone is drained fully of a particular emotion, it'll make them empty, hollow. Without anger, you become weak. Without hope, you might just lie down and die. So go on and try, just be careful. Oh, and don't worry about what emotion to try first. You'll have much more time to specialize later. With a gentle sigh of annoyance, Autumn cast her gaze across the darkened room only lit by the enchanting moonlit and the fading glow of the warm fire. There, resting where she had left it as if mocking her, was the fraying hat. With reluctance, she parted with her comfortable rest and hobbled once again across the chamber to retrieve it. It felt even more mystically heavy than before, and when it fell upon her head, she resolved herself to accept that weight. It was magic, after all. So just grab some emotion? Autumn huffed quietly to herself. Why don't I just bottle sunlight or something while I'm at it? Calm down, Autumn, just try. Autumn took a deep breath. Deep within her body, she searched for the feeling of magic. Perhaps she was a sorcerer instead. It was unlikely, in her opinion, but it didn't hurt to check. There was nothing. No font of dwelling magic or pulse within her veins. Autumn had already ruled out a wizard's path as studying wasn't her forte. Druid too was out, as she had killed every plant she had attempted to nurture. Slow, rhythmic breathing echoed within the enclosed chamber as she delved deeper into her mind and body. Emotions it was, but which? Hope? She wasn't feeling very hopeful about her situation right now. Love? No. Happiness? Not for a long time. Perhaps anger? It was too unruly for her, fleeting in its rising and falling. Sadness? She tried to use it, but the grief she had hidden deep within cut her like the sharpest of razors. Autumn distanced herself before she drowned once more in that familiar river. There was one emotion that almost leapt to her, beckoning, fear. It flitted about her chest like a wild animal within a thunderous storm, always seeking freedom in a choking fit or a wide-eyed scream. It had been a constant companion to Autumn, and it had grown glutinous upon her grief. That deep well of paranoia and fright was a perfect candidate for her magicka. With a delicate hand, she pressed up against her ribcage and sought to grasp onto that feeling. With a thrashing and howling intent, the fear fought back, sending spikes of panic flooding Autumn's system. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as the blood rushed in time with the beast. Her blood felt as if it was boiling and her heart was racing to its doom. Despite how hard she gritted her teeth and pulled, she couldn't wrench it free. Back awash with sweat, Autumn slumped back into her seat and gulped down a steady stream of air to calm her racing heart. She realized her fault was in trying to take far too much, far too soon. Far too excited by the prospect of using magic herself, failure would not scare Autumn away. With no small amount of trepidation in her hands and a thrilled glint in her eyes, Autumn tried again, this time with a gentler hand. She grasped a smaller piece of fear, a spook more than a fright. She cradled it in her palms like a small animal. It felt more like she had spotted a spider or bug on the floor than the looming specter of death. From her chest emerged a coiling form of an inky purplish black worm. Upon being cast into the world of the real, it wrapped itself tightly around Autumn's slim fingers and stained them as it struggled to return to her body. With shaking hands, she drew it up past her face and, with an inordinate amount of effort for its size, she shoved it under her ratty witch's hat. Once she let go, the emotion stayed in place within the crooked hat, making it just a bit heavier. Autumn blinked in confusion and amazement. When she had released her hold upon that thin sliver of fear within her hat, it had become cut off from her. Like tension being loosened on a spring, Autumn's mind felt just a little lighter. It was only the witch's warning and the gargantuan effort it took to carve even the smallest sliver off that stopped her from freeing herself of the rest. Yet she thought to herself deep down that would it be so bad to be without fear? To not have to shy away from everything in fright? Her traitorous mind replayed scene after scene of the terrible events that dominated her life, her humiliations and grief. The tragedy of the accident. Eager to distract herself and learn more, she turned back to the book and continued reading. Now you have presumably extracted some small amount of emotion from yourself or another. You must use it for something. It'd be a waste otherwise. The first thing we'll start with is hexes. A hex is the most common form of witch magic. They can be as simple as a tripping spell or as lethal as a killing curse. But before you learn either, you must first create for yourself an anti-hex charm. Why? Because, my naive apprentice, witches are your biggest threat. We don't get along well and neither do we like to share. Autumn would have set fire to the book with her eyes if she could do so. She was already well aware of the dangers of witches. Settling her anger down, she glanced at the instructions laid out before her. Step 1. First, place 3 intact chicken bones into an equal-sided triangle no larger than an inch long on either side. Step 2. Twine them together at the intersections with a dead man's hair. A dead woman's works fine. Brunette hair works best, but never use ginger. Step 3. Encase the charm in beeswax to seal it. Step 4. Infuse the sealed charm with magic and emotion. Something related to defense works best. Step 5. Finally, place the charm upon your body. It can be on a belt or in a pocket as long as it is on your person. Now remember, it is a single-use charm, as it'll snap if it takes a hex for you, so you might wish to wear multiple. It didn't take long for Autumn to ransack the hut for the listed components even with her injuries and return to the work table. There, she began her first foray into magical crafting. The missing fingers on her right hand proved a hindrance to her efforts. She kept finding herself attempting to use the phantom limbs, and it fouled her work. Yet despite the setbacks, she finished the charm after only snapping a few dry bones. Reaching into her newly gained hat, she pulled free a tiny sliver of fear and poured it into the charm, focusing on the protection she desired. Like a deep purple jelly, it oozed viscously into the charm until it clung to the bones and vanished. Autumn slumped back into the creaking of the chair beneath her. The tedious work had aggravated her burnt fingers. Now they throbbed with a pain that tore into Autumn's mind. With gritted teeth, she clutched tightly at her hand as tears pooled in the corner of her eyes. When the pain had dulled, she glanced down at the tome before her. Perhaps it had something to help her? With renewed vigor, she began leafing through the yellowed pages in search. Page after page of spells or recipes passed her by until she stopped on a particular entry. Herbal Healing Cream. A simple recipe that any young witch should learn. The cream is a basic herbal remedy. It can heal light wounds, cuts, burns, or general muscle fatigue. While it won't be as fast-acting or powerful as an alchemist's healing potion or a cleric's divinely granted prayer, it will be cheaper. The healing cream can be made almost anywhere. The ingredients change per recipe, but as long as you infuse a positive emotion, it'll work to varying degrees. Below, you'll find my recipe that I've found works best without relying on any convoluted ingredients. Step 1. Finely ground together 2 dried eel leaves and 5 dandelion flowers, no stems. Step 2. Add wrath leech juice until the mixture is covered fully. Step 3. Mix until you have a smooth mixture. Add more wrath leech if necessary. Step 4. Add arrowroot flour, mixing until you have a creamy consistency. Step 5. Infuse the mixture with a positive emotion, love, care, happiness, etc. All manner of bottles and jars filled the shelving above her. Whatever labels that had been upon them had worn away in the moonlight as dim as was. Now only faded paper remained. Luckily, Witch August had illustrated the ingredients alongside the recipe, so Autumn could compare each ingredient to the drawings. Eel leaves looked just like their namesake. Long thin, they rested within a sealed glass jar. Dandelion flowers were the same bright golden color she recognized from Earth, and wrath leeches looked just as she was expecting, just in a bright slimy orange. Into an old stone mortar and pestle the ingredients went, and with only a little difficulty she had a creamy mixture spooned into a lacquered wooden tub about the size of her palm. All it needed now was joy. Something Autumn was in short supply but not devoid of, which was a surprise to her. Despite the horror she had endured, all the pain and suffering, she found a small part of herself was joyous at the act of creation. She was an artist at heart, after all. So she reached out to that tiny nugget of joy inside and it rushed to fulfill her needs. It was much harder to hold back and not empty herself. It was almost too eager to be used. The mixture was complete. Autumn felt drained as the rush of joy left her body. All she had now was pain and ever-present fear. Hugging her knees, Autumn cried. Being without joy was no foreign thing to her, but never this sudden, this otherworldly. She now understood the warning that the witch had written. If she felt like this all the time, if she had hollowed herself of joy, then she might not carry on anymore. Wiping away the tears in her eyes, Autumn snatched up the jar she had made and sought to fix up her aches and pains. A long road home stretched out before her and she'd never make it if she couldn't even take the first step. The bandages wrapped around her feet had practically glued themselves together with her sticky blood. They peeled away with a hair-raising stickiness and tore at her scabbed feet, causing them to bleed freely once more. Drops of blood fell unbidden as she carefully applied the salve. Autumn tensed in agony for a moment before a numbing cooling spread throughout. With fresh bandages, Autumn re-wrapped her feet before slipping into a pair of woolen socks that were only mildly musty and moth-eaten. What she had left of the paste ended up rubbed into the burnt stumps of her fingers. Autumn had aid, and she had protection, but what she lacked was offense. She turned back to the tome. One page she had flipped past in her search had caught her interest. Now she flicked back and reread it. Basic Jinx. The Jinx is the first spell many witches will learn and cast. It is the bread and butter, if you'll forgive the phrase, of any witch's spell list. While not as deadly or long-lasting as a hex or curse, jinxes are faster to cast and less draining on both magic and materials. Furthermore, a jinx can be used with any emotion to varying effects. Tailor your jinx to yourself. Make it follow your will and desires and it'll never fail you. While any spell catalyst will be capable of casting a jinx, I find a wand works best as you can aim far better than, say, a staff or amulet. If you found this tome within my hut, you may use mine. If not, Well, good luck. Luckily for Autumn, it didn't take long to find the wand mentioned by the old witch. The wand had been sitting on the workbench itself, just hidden amongst the other esoteric items. 11 inches long and bent like an old weathered finger. The color of the wood was unlike anything Autumn had seen before in nature, like an iron rod carved with wood grain. Her hand wrapped around a cold white bone handle and the wand sat with a comforting weight within. Before Autumn could allow her imagination to truly unfurl, a loud snap interrupted her thoughts. With a frightened, nervous glance, she checked her newly made ward. It was unbroken. Another snap resounded faintly within the space, echoing from outside the confines of the witch's abode from the shattered window. As an icy chill crept and crawled up her spine, Autumn shuffled on healing feet to the broken view. Outside and across the weed-filled lawn was a sight that sent shivers down her skin. The wild hunters had crept closer in the night. Not only that, but more fur and bone-clad fae had gathered before her. A small host that was nearly 100 large had camped outside the witch's protections. Autumn saw magnificent stags larger than any possible, with antlers that rose high into the sky. Between roots stretched many tents of skin and hides and patrolling hunters who watched the hut with focused intent. The way back was thoroughly blocked. What was even more concerning was that the wards that fended off the incursion as they were failing. Now and then she saw the fae steadily pushing against the protections, their wild magics sapping what little witchcraft the aged bird skulls and rusted iron kept. Witch August's safeguards were fleeting and Autumn's time was running out. Yet all was not lost. As it seemed the wards slowed the hunters' progress, each arduous step towards the hut had to be fought for with a grand outpouring of magic, and it also appeared that the flow of the dead river had somewhat hampered the wild hunt. The thousands of riders that shook the world with their endless stampede hadn't arrived yet. Autumn knew she had to leave, but when? For a moment, she watched from beside the frame. The charms snapped and iron crumbled as she watched and counted. From the speed and progress made, she estimated she had at least a day, maybe less, till they reached the doorway. She hoped that the rusty iron horseshoe above it would buy her more time. Shit. Autumn tried not to panic, but that was a hard thing to ask when she did not know what she was doing or where she might run to. The only thing she knew was it needed to be away from here. All right, chill. First grab some of this stuff. Autumn lugged an ancient canvas bag with frayed leather straps about the room. Into it went her supplies for the harrowing journey before her: spare clothes, underwear, and woolen socks. There was little food remaining as she had eaten what dried scraps had remained. If she rationed properly, she had at least 3 days of nuts and berries. Water, however, was a major concern. All she had left was a mouthful of very stale wine. During her search, she found several interesting items, some not so helpful now, but if she survived, they might be rather handy. For example, while on her hands and knees, she peeked under the bed and found a pouch that clinked with coins. The handful inside bore a symbol of a crooked tree on either side. There was a single lonely gold, 12 silver pieces, and 32 tiny bronze coins. How much that was truly worth, Autumn did not know. It could be a basic wage for all she knew, but she secreted it away into her robes, hidden within one of the smuggling pockets. What was more handy in the immediate terms was a thick leather belt that held a long iron knife within a sheath. The heavy belt strapped about Autumn's waist and the knife rested upon her hip and thigh. The weapon brought a sense of reassurance she was rather thin on. Glancing over at the shelves, Autumn debated whether to snag a few for later. On one hand, they'd weigh her down while on the other they might be useful, or at the very least, she could sell them. Fuck it, Autumn decided and gathered up as many of the more interesting jars and containers into her bag till it was nearly full. The last time on her list of preparations was the boots. She had been dreading putting them on. She could wait till she left, but she did not know when that would be. Better to suffer now than lose out on the opportunity later. It took a fair few minutes of wincing and struggling to slip her feet into the softened leather before she laced them up tight. They didn't fit perfectly, being made for someone with smaller feet than her, but they didn't pinch too much. They'd still suck to run in, but it beat thorns in her feet again. Now she felt prepared to travel through the haunting forest. She slumped down upon the rickety bed that howled at her action. Autumn wondered how long she had been awake. It could have been only a minute or it could have spanned hours. It felt like it, at least. Her limbs shook and ached and her body shivered with the fever still racking her body. She wanted to sleep, yet she couldn't. There was still more to do. Slowly and with as much focused intent as she could desperately muster, she began harvesting her emotions. Fear fell away from her in streams as they surrendered themselves to her witch's hat. All the power she could gain now would make her flight on the morrow all that more possible. It was only when her hat felt as heavy as a mountain and threatening to burst she stopped. She had drawn out as much as she could, yet she still felt afraid. even if it was just a little. With an aching body and mind, she fell into an exhausted slumber as the haunting metronome of breaking charms sounded off in the distance. Murky and broken dreams slipped past her mind's eye like a water's vapor. It distressed her slumber with its wake. In one moment, she spied a matronly figure dressed familiarly. It tingled her recollection, but Autumn couldn't make out her face as it was a blur of distorted flesh. No matter how hard she fought to approach the matron, the dream doomed Autumn to fall further and further away. Each step cracked the ground like glass till it shattered and she fell into the depthless deep. Fell into the inky abyss. Falling faster and faster. Down. Down. Down she went. Down for what felt like forever until the ground rushed up to meet her in a blur of fright and motion. Just as she was about to impact the black bedrock below, she awoke with a gasp. Autumn tumbled off her bed and the cold, hard slap of a stone floor greeted her face. Groaning in pain, Autumn rose, clutching at her face, still tangled by the twisting bedcloth. Outside, the crooked moon still hung in place and shed a foggy moonlight into Autumn's abode. No matter what happened today, it would be the last time she would awake in this place. And hopefully this endless night within the Feywild. Autumn dug about in her pack for a mouthful of dried nuts and berries to satisfy her moaning stomach. Like a mountain, the weathered hat sat upon her brow packed full of magic. Upon her back went her canvas pack and around her waist went the knife and wand. Autumn was as ready as she'd ever be to run or fight. Deep within her chest, the hollow ache of overdrawn emotion had soothed with rest, but she still felt strange, lighter than ever before. Above the entranceway sat that rusted iron horseshoe. Autumn clasped it and wrenched it free of its mooring. Down it came in a shower of dust and rust, sprinkling Autumn in its debris. After coughing away the dustiness in her lungs, Autumn peeked outside through the shattered window. Either the Fae didn't need or want sleep. Through the endless night while Autumn had slept, they had continued their assault. Gradually, they had crept closer to their prey in its burrow. Now they stood a bare few meters from the front of the crumbling cottage, eager to kill and consume. It was time to leave.